Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our Share Green Design podcast. Today we have with us Katrina Land, a circular economy expert from Ramboll, and she's based in San Francisco at the moment, but she will tell us a bit more about her and her role and her background a bit later. But to start with,
Yeah.
and to give some direction and to give an intro to what we are going to be talking about, which is mainly about circular economy. Could you please tell us what is circular economy and how would you describe it?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I've been listening to some of the other podcasts and it's great. So I'm happy to be here. So first off, I think it's a good start to kind of defining circular economy and what we mean when we talk about this. So circular economy is an alternative to a linear economy, which I think most people are operating in today, which is the classical take, make, waste economy, where we are sourcing something, we're using it, and we're throwing it away. Usually it ends up in a landfill. So as an alternative to that, we are talking about a circular economy. And that is a system where materials never become waste. And to maybe relate that to something that people are familiar with, we can talk of any product actually, like maybe a chair. Most people have a chair in their home. So it could start from all the way from the beginning when we are making this chair. We want to minimize the use of virgin materials and also how we are designing it. We want to design out waste. So when we are producing this, we want to create as little waste as possible. So we're optimizing our production and we want to use circular and sustainable materials. So for example, with a chair, minimize toxins, chemicals, so that we can, after the end of life, we can reuse that chair or alternatively use reused materials. And if you are the consumer, consider buying a reused chair or a second on a secondhand market on a, somewhere where you can find a chair. And the other one is, so when you have that chair, you want to keep that chair in a good within a good value and like as long as possible. So you want to maintain it. If something happens, you can repair it so that you can keep it in use as long as possible. And also, if you don't feel like that chair suits your living room maybe anymore, if you're moving, instead of throwing it out, you could resell it. And that way, that gets like a second life in another home. And at the end of the life, you really feel like, okay, this chair cannot live anymore. I've done what I can to repair it, maintain it. It keeps falling apart. Then take those materials and see what else can I do with it. Can I reuse it for another product? Can we upcycle it? And then keep those materials and those kind of like embodied values that you've put into that in the highest use as possible after the end of life. So that's kind of like relating it to something that most people know, but it's
Yep.
basically um, create a system that don't create waste and consider waste as resources.
Mhm. I think that's interesting, and it's important that you mentioned people that might not know what we are talking about, because we hope that our audience gets wider, and there are people that are not experts on the topic that
Mm.
are interested in learning about this. So, what I would say about circular economy as well is that we could see it. I would like to see what you think about the approach, because you mentioned design out waste, which is fundamental to the way we design buildings or infrastructure, anything actually at the moment. But there is another part of circular economy, which is everything that exists already, which
Mm.
hasn't been necessarily designed for disassembly or with a circular economy in mind, but we still have a duty to reuse as much as we can from that.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
what would be your thinking on those? Because I think for future, I think we maybe have a bit more strategy. So, what would be your thinking on those that are already exist and what can be done, and what you are doing on your work as well?
Mm. I think that's a very good question and it's very relevant. When I work and talk about circular economy, I like to also divide it into two, like you've also put here. So kind of like how do we consider what we already have and how can we maintain and utilize that in the best way possible, and how can we learn from the problems that we are seeing today and how we are reusing, repurposing what we have, and how can we integrate kind of the lessons learned from that in our future designs, productions, infrastructure. So one thing that is very important when we are considering how we can handle our existing building mass, if we're talking about buildings, is how can we also learn from the problems that we have today. So that's the one thing that I think is really important. And then the other part is, I think it's, I mean, we know that we have almost all the buildings, so we have a lot of the buildings that we need if we can figure out how to fully utilize those. So we can look at it like in two different ways. I feel like the first one is how can we actually, if we have a building, it's set for maybe demolition, how can we challenge that brief and say, okay, do we really have to demolish this building, or is there a better way of using that, right? There's adaptive reuse, you can transform it. So one is how can we actually keep it there and build less?
Mhm.
That's actually the key thing. We don't actually have to build that much more. We can also figure out how can we transform, how can we utilize our existing building mass better, both like in terms of adaptive reuse and things like that, but also how can we have maybe two functionalities? It can have one during the day and one during the night.
Mhm.
So then two functions can fit in one building instead of two. So that's one thing. And the other one is like if we really are to demolish a building, let's move away from the demolition part, where we're kind of like classically seeing this wrecking ball that kind of like goes in and then smashes everything and a lot goes to landfill. Let's try kind of like to move away from, Miley Cyrus and that
Mm.
part,
Yeah.
and move into where we're looking at deconstruction, and we're looking at how can we capture the value that's there? How can we capture the embodied, like the environmental values, the social and the economic values that's embodied in our materials? And one part of that is actually understanding what we have and kind of also shifting our mindset to seeing that our existing building mass is actually, it's a big material bank,
Yeah.
right? And how can we harvest those values that's
Mm.
already there? And that's through, understanding our building mass better, doing environmental surveys, mapping our resources, mapping hazardous substances, figure out
Mhm.
how can we also create infrastructure to support this, to actually extract those materials. I mean, that's like a whole value chain that needs to be supported to be able to, extract, test, redocument, and there's the whole logistic part, right? And then actually finding the right building to put it in again with the right technical properties, so it's also safe to reuse them.
I think that's all very interesting, and my feeling is that we could spend a few hours talking about this because it's so wide. But
Yeah, it
let's see
is.
how good we can do in 30, 40 minutes. There is something you said earlier that really, uh, you know, it's I think it's one of the keys is, and we don't talk about it enough, is using the same building for two things. I think that's one of the keys. So we also had a series of webinars where I believe it was Kelly Alvarez Duran. He said that he was referring to North America. He's from Canada, and he was saying we already have the buildings we need. So all we have to do is use less space in some cases because we have huge spaces that are not needed. So
Mm.
anyway, that was one line of thought. Something else that I've been discussing with a few friends and colleagues over the last couple of years is what you said about using the buildings for more than one thing. For example, a school. Why a school can be used solely from 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. or 2. Then
Mm.
what happens with it? Then that space is not used anymore. Or the weekends. Sometimes it is for cultural events, or but it's not widely used. So I think what you said about urban mining and
Mm.
using those materials somewhere else, I think we actually have to go one step before and do building mining and finding those buildings maybe that could be used for something else.
Yeah,
So
that's a
have,
really
have
good
you been
point.
involved in any initiative like that?
That's a good question, and I think like I really like that thought actually, like mining buildings instead of building materials, figuring out like more on an urban scale and kind of looking at a bigger picture than just one building. Like how can they create like a symbiosis between each other, and how can they leverage the space in between? Like maybe there's also, I mean, I haven't I think I've been a lot involved in a lot of adaptive reuse projects, but not actually someone that was only looking at how can we better or how can we utilize this for two different ones. I mean, there's a lot of collaboration and dialogue between that, right?
Exactly, and that's the key is the collaboration, isn't it? Is because to
Yeah.
make that happen, each building at the moment and the way our societies are organized is this building is for that and is managed by these people, this one is for that,
Mm,
and it's all well structured. And for the circular economy on a holistic view and a wider approach, I think we need things to happen more horizontally, as you said that, because when you think about it, then you start thinking for that to happen, these people need to talk to those people, and it's because
yeah.
if something happens in that building, whose insurance, and then it gets complicated. But I think it's the same as with the materials. You need to, as you said earlier, when you reuse it, you need to ensure that they are fit for purpose.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a thought, and but I
Yeah.
like when you said that it's. I was thinking on a metric that could be that before a metric that could be the number of hours that a building is used over a year to determine um, efficiency of the use of a space. Because, for example, when you link it with carbon, and that's
Mm,
my
yeah.
next question,
That's a
so
really
you
good
could
point
have a very
actually.
low because if you have a very low embodied carbon building, but it's used very little, is it the efficient way of the material as opposed to another one with higher embodied carbon, but is used much
Mm,
more? So anyway, that's just my thought. So that I think could be interesting for the
yeah.
rest of the
I'm
conversation.
noting that down for my work.
We can have another follow-up session. So on the carbon and linking
Yeah.
with carbon actually, because there is a lot of talk about carbon in the last few years, and in embodied carbon, especially in the most 3, 4, 5, 6 recent years, depending on where we are in the world. Before that was operational carbon, and I see that happening now with circular economy. So I think if we could have access to Google search and see the words that are more searched, on their platform, we would probably see that circular economy is going up and up. But I've been asked as well about circular economy, and I find it more difficult to explain as well than
Mm,
carbon, because carbon is something that, as a concept, is easy to quantify. So you can measure carbon, kilos of carbon. Circular economy is something more difficult to quantify. So, what would be your view? How do you explain that when talking to clients or
mm.
government or policymakers about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think you also touched upon like the first thing that I would say is that carbon or greenhouse gases, it's easy to quantify. You have like one metric that you're using, like kilo CO2 equivalent. So it's easy and people can understand what it is. I think as we also, or as I touched upon in the beginning, circular economy is also very broad. It's not only considering carbon, it's not only considering waste or resources. It's like a big umbrella that covers, it covers carbon, it covers resources. It's about how you source, so it covers a broad variety. So it's difficult maybe to find one metric to quantify how good you're doing or what is the effect of what you're designing into your building. So one thing that I'm always saying is that there's no kind of decarbonization or effective decarbonization without circular economy. Because if you are
mm,
working with circular economy, decarbonization is a natural kind of byproduct. Because if we know through, if we're familiar with life cycle assessments and kind of like a carbon profile of building material or a product, any product actually, we know that most of the carbon emissions, if you're looking throughout a life cycle, is related to the upfront emissions. So that's like where you're sourcing your materials, you're processing, transporting before it actually is put into use. And that is kind of the aspect that circular economy is tackling very efficiently because we are trying to avoid that.
mhm,
We're trying to avoid sourcing new materials. So instead of mining, new materials and producing and processing, we're figuring out how can we use what we have today. So by doing that, we're kind of cutting most of the upfront emissions, which is one of the most effective ways of decarbonizing, especially when you're talking, of course,
yeah,
embodied carbon. Operational is another. So it's just a really efficient tool for decarbonizing. And also when you look at a supply chain as well. And so that's kind of like touching upon
mhm,
the carbon, but then it's also like it covers biodiversity.
yeah,
We know that more than 90% of biodiversity loss is due to kind of extraction and processing of natural resources. And if we can cut that down and instead learn how can we use what we have today, and also actually how can we use less stuff, how can we figure out how to actually maintain what we have and not always buy something new. So it's also like eliminating the need for extraction and processing of new materials and natural resources. And then you have also, I can continue, but then you also have the social value. Because I like to say also that a circular economy is a local economy. If you are working with reuse of materials, you want to kind of figure out how to reuse that in the local area so you don't like have to transport it all the way to another country because then I mean the emissions are
mhm,
rising anyway because you're using some sort of transportation. So when you're working with circular economy, it also has like a community benefit. It creates local jobs. For example, by deconstruction, you need more people to do that. You need more people to handle materials. It's also developing workforce in the local communities. And I also saw a study that was actually very interesting that handled the aspect of job creation in a circular economy versus a linear economy, where I think the the point was how you are treating waste. So you're looking at 10,000 tons of waste and how many jobs that creates.
mhm,
So in a linear economy where that goes to landfill, that would need about 1 to 6 jobs per 10,000 tons. If you're looking at a circular economy, it will create 300 jobs.
yeah,
So it's a huge possibility for also employing people and creating jobs and also local jobs. And we can also see that like when we're working with circular economy, for example, here in the US, you can also get waived or faster permitting because if you're working with that and if you're contributing to the local community, that would create or fasten that process. And somewhere you can also get waived permitting fees if you are contributing a lot to the local community.
mhm. I think that's a really good response because you've linked everything there with circular economy, which is
Hmm.
definitely much bigger than carbon or greenhouse gases emissions. So, and the good thing is that it's happening, and we see more and more, and we see that in the projects and briefs, clients brief to with the more focus on circular economy. What we need
Mm.
is metrics, I think, also because then once if we are able as an industry to put something that you can quantify and measure, then there can be targets and then benchmarks and all that, and we can ask
Mm.
everybody to comply with that. But anyway, I think that was very good. And the you work on a book or a document with Ramboll, so or you took part or led, and you can explain that. That was called, and I have it in my notes. Sorry, so it was the Handbook for Circular Economy. So
Yeah.
could you tell us a bit about that and what the work that Ramboll are doing that front and your background and how did you get
Mm.
to that and how you got involved in circular economy, and also because there are so many things you could focus on in your career and you are young. So where did that interest from circular economy came? Because it's like I mean, it's a really wide term and topic, but still it's something very specific.
Yeah, that's a lot of things in one
Yeah,
question. I will
let's go
start
one by
with
one.
my yeah, I will start with my background.
Yeah.
So right now, yeah, as you said, I'm in San Francisco, California, working in Ramboll as the technical lead for our circular economy and resource management practice. So we and my colleague are developing this practice here now. Before I transferred to California 9 months ago, so it's still pretty new. So my background is actually within structural engineering. I worked before actually I got into sustainability and anything. I worked as a structural engineer in a company that was very much focused on renovation projects, how we are operating and working in the existing building mass, and also cultural heritage and historic buildings. So I was working a lot also on site, and I saw, not for the historic buildings, but I saw on the renovation projects and transformation projects how much waste was generated during that process. And I think that just amazed me, that we couldn't figure out a system how to use those really good resources better, because these are also old buildings, right? So the quality of the materials were really good, and they were just, getting sent in a container and sent off, not even reused or recycled, probably recycled. And then on the other hand, kind of like in the opposite end of the spectrum, I was working with, cultural heritage and historic buildings, where the main aim was always to maintain as much as possible of the structure. So there you could really see the potential of how much you could optimize the process and how you actually could find out systems and also source old and reused materials. We were working with, one time we were working with a client who had his own material storage. He owned a lot of buildings and kept all the materials. So when we were working on his properties, we went to his storage and found old materials that we could reuse, in his buildings.
Hmm.
So that's kind of like how I got into circular economy. And also personally, I've always been, I grew up in Norway, from Norway, and I've always been very connected to nature and been outdoors, and it has always been a very also personal interest of mine. And also a lot of my hobbies has been tied to nature, like snow, water, wind, and like the last 10, 15 years, right? We can already see that changing. So for me, like I've seen it firsthand only like in those years, like I've been here, right? So it's moving so quickly. So both getting into it from, my professional, career as a structural engineer, actually just shifting a little bit and being, this is what I want to do full time. I want to like dedicate my career and do what I can to make a difference and shift the way that we are working. So after working as a structural engineer and also getting into material reuse and how we can also quantify that, of course, by using life cycle assessments, getting into embodied carbon. I mean, you know, that is circular economy. So I kind of started working with that before I actually, you know, really knew the term. And then I shifted from that company to working at Ramboll full time in sustainability and circular economy in Copenhagen. So yeah, I was 10 years in Denmark before I came here. So I had a lot of years working there. And then, yeah, as I said, get into Ramboll on focusing 100% on sustainability. And that's kind of like through the whole spectrum. So I was in the sustainability consultancy department where we were working all the way from the early stage, like strategy point of view, through design, through implementation, through actually construction. So it was like it was covering the whole spectrum, which was really, really good, and really I learned a lot. And also there I got a possibility to kind of work and expand our circular economy practice there as well, together with some colleagues. So that's kind of like where getting to that book actually,
Yeah.
where we saw a gap. So when we were addressing circular economy with clients and also just internally, we saw that there was a big gap both in knowledge and in frameworks and in how we are measuring and quantifying that. And also just like creating a streamlined system for integration and implementation of circular economy in the built environment. So our approach to that was like, how do we create this framework? And that's kind of like where that handbook was born. So we went together and developed this framework that created a streamlined approach and also kind of like set a foundation for what people knew about circular economy. So it's also educational to kind of like get everyone up to a level where they're able to talk about it and have a common understanding. So as I think we have also talked about a little bit before, we're kind of like dividing this into two. How do we work with our existing building mass through reuse, through adaptive reuse, and how do we prepare for circular economy in the future? That is where we're working with principles such as design for deconstruction, you know, material passports, digital technologies, digital twin. And you
Mm,
talked about this before as
mm,
well. So kind of like how do we implement it throughout the whole value chain kind of and throughout project,
mm.
and also how do we measure it?
Yeah.
So
And I think that's all very interesting. And you mentioned
yeah,
a few things there, that you are from Norway, you work in Denmark, and then you were transferred, I think that's the word you used, to San
yeah.
Francisco in California. So, how is that for someone? You mentioned water, snow, wind. You are now in a completely different weather and climate altogether. There might
Mhm.
be wind, but definitely not much snow or not even water, at least rain. I don't know, but
Well,
so,
there is
but from
actually.
okay, all right. So I wasn't aware of that. I've never been to San
Yeah.
Francisco, but from a cultural and professional point of view, how do you find that? So you were obviously doing that work there, and I guess Rambo have decided that they want to enhance or let's say grow that business in Rambo because they see an opportunity there. So how do you find that change from Europe, Norway, Denmark to California, San Francisco, the US?
Yeah. It's interesting, and I like also learning and seeing the drivers here. That's a little bit different. And of course, you're kind of learning and kind of adapting circular economy to that as well. So I feel like I'm learning, you know, so much because we're getting different angles of this. I feel like every day I'm learning something new. So of course, as I mentioned, the drivers are a little bit different here, and also there's a different culture and a different mindset. So going to the regulatory drivers, I mean, we have more of those in Europe, and we are a little bit further ahead. like we have also pretty established frameworks, or they are getting there. Like for example, with the EU taxonomy, we see more and more people kind of, or companies aligning with that and integrating circular economy through that. We have CSRD that is coming up with circular economy through companies and products and buildings. So it's getting more mainstream, and I think people know more about it in Europe. Um, but another thing that I think has been very interesting to see here is that even though some elements there might be further behind, and I have to say, actually, a disclaimer, I'm in California, and I think maybe California is not representative for the whole US, of course, but I can talk, through California, and we're also working, of course, across other states. But so one example is here in California. Now we are getting embodied carbon regulations,
Mhm.
and people or companies, we have not been talking about that for a long time here. It is a pretty new concept, but once they decide that this is going to come, we're going to start focusing on that. It's happening so quick. So in Denmark, when we did this, we were preparing for a long time. And right now, in California, this is getting adopted 1st of June or July 2024. And no one is really, working with this now. So people are just like, they're deciding
How do we do
something,
it,
and they
right?
try
It's
it out, right? And then we figure it out. So things are moving very quickly.
yeah.
And of course, there are other drivers here as well. For example, with deconstruction, there are tax incentives that can kind of offset the extra cost of doing a deconstruction. So there's other financial incentives here. But yeah, and also of course the culture and the mindset is very different. But again, I think we just have to adapt and also kind of learn what angle do we need kind of here to get circular economy in,
Mm.
because here it's also like companies are doing it because it is a good business model,
Okay, that's
because
yeah.
you're not paying for waste disposal and landfills. I was also in a project in Puerto Rico where they're trying to figure out how they can eliminate waste because the landfills in Puerto Rico are filling up.
Hmm.
So it's actually to create a resilient company. So it's like, how do we mitigate our waste so we don't have to pay those fees that are coming to landfill? And once those landfills are filled up, what are we going to do with our waste? So it's practical stuff that are pushing this as well, and they're not calling it circular economy. It's like, how do we prepare ourselves for the future, and how do we create a resilient company and processes?
Hmm. And I think that's the other question I wanted to ask you about opportunities and incentives and how the incentives can create opportunities as well.
Yeah. So for example, with if I can go back to the deconstruction part that I talked about, which is one that I see like a very big market opportunity for when we're talking about reuse of materials. And this is right now, it's mostly on a city level. So there are certain cities that has requirement for deconstruction. So you're not allowed to demolish a building. So you have to apply for a permit and then you have to deconstruct it. And a lot of deconstruction contractors are seeing a huge business opportunity in this. Like, instead of again paying for waste disposal, they're seeing a new revenue stream. So how can we capture the value kind of embodied in our materials and create new revenue streams?
Mhm.
So this is a natural one, right? And when they are creating a supply, the demand is following. So that's a big opportunity. And there, it's again connecting back to our embodied carbon regulation that's coming up in California, and it's already actually adopted in Vancouver in Canada.
Mhm.
If you are including reused materials in your LCA, the upfront embodied carbon is close to zero, not completely zero, but it's low. And then also on the other side, if you're working with design for disassembly, you are only accounting for half of the end of life carbon emissions. So this is also creating a demand for circular materials and also for reused materials. So it's all kind of like connected together there. So that's, I
Yeah.
think the deconstruction one is it's a really interesting one. And also that's where you can see tax incentives.
Mhm.
So if you are donating your materials to a nonprofit that has the aim to kind of either upcycle or reuse the materials, you get a tax credit. So then you get money back that can offset the extra cost of the deconstruction. So it's a win-win. It's a win-win for the deconstruction contractor and for the client, right?
Yeah. And for
And
the
for the
environment.
receiver, of course, right? And it's a good
Yeah.
business case.
It is good. Is that the scheme in California? What you're referring to?
That's it's in some cities, so this is not. Do you mean the deconstruction one?
Yeah, the tax incentive that you were
Yes.
referring to.
Yeah, yeah. So this is actually I don't. I think it might actually be like on across the countries.
Okay.
That I
I know,
have
but
to say I'm not
it's a
sure,
really
but it's
good
yeah,
scheme that could be replicated anywhere
right.
almost
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's win-win for everybody. Now there is a question about when we talk about circular economy. We and again I'm going to refer back to that webinar that we organized for uh, with some partners in Kenya. When they heard talking about circular economy, some of the people ask about it, or more than asking, they were pointing out that that's all good for economies or countries that are developed, but in other countries that are growing at the moment, they don't have that mass of buildings. I think you said the term you used earlier,
Hmm.
that mass of materials in the loop, let's say at the moment. So they need to invest and they need more material until they get to that level when they can start or let's say use a full circular economy. So what would be your view, or what would you say to those countries that are developing, and what can they learn from what we've done wrong in other
Hmm.
in another part of the world?
Hmm. That's a really interesting aspect, and I've been thinking about this as well. And I think that circular economy looks different depending on where you are. Like when you're saying in developing countries, they don't have a big existing building mass and also maybe not access to abundance of materials.
Mhm,
So I think in those countries, I think actually we could learn a lot as well, because if you don't have an infinite amount of materials, you are kind of minimizing waste automatically because the value of the materials are so high. So in that way, you are already kind of utilizing as much as you can of the materials that you have.
mhm,
So that's one part. Like you are upfront, kind of, you are utilizing, you are designing out waste, and you're not wasting valuable materials. And I think another aspect is that they can, of course, think about how can we integrate circular principles upfront. So how can we integrate, for example, design for deconstruction principles, and how can we learn from other countries about what chemicals we don't put into into our buildings so that we can reuse them after end of life. So that's one aspect, but I think it is very interesting because I mean we can see a shift in our processes as well from before the industrialization. We did talk about this actually another time, where I mean we had local materials. That was what we had. We were And materials were valuable, because extraction and transport, it was expensive. We didn't have the oil, so it was before the industrialization. That's where
mhm,
we actually utilized our material in a good way because they were so valuable. So the materials were more expensive than the labor cost and the design. So that's where we kind of like we made good construction, we made good materials, like they lasted because they
Hmm.
were so valuable. And then kind of the oil era came, and industrialization in the 18th and 19th century, where it became easy to transport, it became easy to extract. We had so much materials, and our labor and the design kind of became more expensive. So that's kind of where we can see a shift in the quality of our buildings, in the quality of our materials. So I think also like we actually need to go back to where, and I think that's also where we're heading now,
Yep.
because we are seeing resource scarcity, we are seeing supply chain disruption where we can't get our materials because of climate disasters, like with the Suez Canal, where
Mm.
we couldn't get anything for a very long time. So I think that we are actually, we're heading back
Mhm.
there, and that's what I'm hoping, where we're moving to a place where our materials are becoming more valuable than or more expensive than our labor and our design. So we need to actually figure out again, how can we reuse and how can we utilize what we have. And that's
Mhm.
also raw materials, like going back to your question,
Yeah.
that I think that we need to move actually back to that. And also
And use,
making good construction, good
yeah,
connections.
and also the good construction, and also trying to build as efficient as possible using
Right.
less resources,
Yeah.
because as you
Yeah.
pointed out, it's not just the carbon, it's that there are less scarcity of resources, so
Mm-hmm.
we have to use much less to, and achieve the same. Going back, and when we discuss with some colleagues, and again, and working about that, they always refer to, we used to do this 40 years ago, we used to do this 50 years ago, and that's where we are going for the reasons you said earlier. Now, one, so circular economy is definitely the way to go. It's happening, but it's still not happening at the speed we would like it to happen, or it could happen because there are barriers
Mm.
for it to be implemented. So what do you think is the main barrier, or which are the two main barriers from your point of view for a wider implementation of circular economy approaches?
Yeah. I think that we're meeting a lot of roadblocks at the moment. But I think a few of the main ones, like one is regulation to get it up to scale. I mean, I think that we've kind of established we are moving from kind of like the why we should do this to the how, and how we can do it at scale.
Mm.
Because we have that kind of common consensus that we need to do something, we need to change if we're gonna, tackle our crisis. And I think that to do that at scale, we need regulation. We need to be regulated, and I think then we will figure out how to do it as well. And through that, we also need education, because we need to educate people about what is circular economy, and also figure out what's the value of it actually. Because what we're seeing now is that when we are talking about circular economy, for example, in design projects, the feedback that we are getting often is like, oh, it's so expensive, oh, it's so difficult. And then it's like, let's break this down and talk point by point. And then once we actually break it down, go through it, and have a more kind of like holistic assessment, also with relation to cost and feasibility, it's not that hard. So we need to just understand and have like that holistic point of view as well. And then of course it's the most like more technical parts, where we need the infrastructure, right? We need systems that support, for example, storage of materials, how we extract them, how do we work with the design for disassembly. Like there's also some infrastructure challenges, but I would say like regulation, education, and infrastructure actually is a
Okay.
few of the big ones.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. So I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and it's we've gone a bit beyond the time we were
Yeah,
planning to discuss initially. But it's definitely a topic we could continue talking for a long time. So I
yeah.
think before we finish, what is your view of what's or more than your view? So what is yeah? How you see the next, let's say next year, like the as a friend of mine says, it's the today, tomorrow, and 2050 of circular economy. So how far you think we can get with circular economy in terms of implementation in the short term
Mm,
due to all the barriers you said about, but what is are you optimistic about what we can achieve in 5 6 years time, and then in 25 or 26 years time, 2050, because it looks like we are all targeting everything
mm.
zero by 2050. So what would be your perspective for all those for these three time approaches or
Yeah.
scales, sorry, time scales?
Well, I think I'm trying, always to stay positive, because if we don't, I mean, there's so many horrible things happening as well. So I feel like we need to stay optimistic about this. So I'm staying optimistic. I think that there's a huge potential, and I also think that it's possible to do this at scale. I think in the short term, I feel like I'm hoping that we are seeing, that we are already seeing, more regulations and frameworks being developed, like in the really short term, so that we can actually start to measure and benchmark circularity, and maybe like having, one indicator that makes it easier, like we have with carbon, and also that we are getting this into building codes and national regulations. And then I hope that we are, as a starting point, actually, when we are developing or, creating master planning and stuff like that, I hope that we are, before kind of like automatically thinking about new buildings, I hope the first part is thinking about how can we use what we have, and how can we actually build less.
Mhm.
And I just also hope that we are, and that's in general within buildings and everything, like shift and use less stuff in general. And I think that we are already kind of, we can see that in the younger generation as well. Like, they're going reuse shopping instead of shopping new things.
Mm,
And I think that there is a mind shift. And also the younger generation is more interested in, living more sustainable, living maybe in smaller places, sharing economies. So I think that we will see more of that. And then, like, I of course hope that in the future, like long term, also we will build fully circular buildings where we are not creating waste, and where we are creating waste, I hope that that can kind of be recirculated and be, resources for other companies or other factories, so that we are creating this symbiosis between companies and between in urban areas, so that we are not creating waste, we're creating
mm.
resources.
Yeah, I think that's a really good response, and that links back to what we said earlier about collaboration, which is
Mm,
key in all this, isn't it? That
yeah.
it's not just our business, our backyard, is how we all work together. So
Yeah, that's the key. You can't really do circular economy in a vacuum.
yeah. So thank you very much again. It's been really insightful, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to continue this conversation in the future. And actually, I'm thinking now that it would be good to catch up in the we said short like within a year or so. Would be good to catch up
Yeah.
again within a year or so and see how things have evolved and look
Mm.
back at what we said and then and see where we really are and what's happening,
Oh yeah.
which I'm sure will be, I hope I'm positive as well like you, optimistic, and I hope there will be a lot of things moving. So thank you very
Yeah.
much again, and a
Thank you
pleasure
so
talking
much.
to you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.